In the misty hollows of the Great Smoky Mountains, where ancient Cherokee footpaths wind through forests older than memory, there exists a collection of stories so strange and terrifying that they have shaped the very soul of Appalachia. These are not the sanitized tales found in tourist brochures or the gentle legends shared around modern campfires. These are the deep, dark stories that were whispered in cabin doorways on moonless nights. The warnings passed down through generations of mountain folk who understood that the wilderness holds secrets far more dangerous than any bear or wildcat. This is a land where the veil between worlds has always been thin, where Cherokee shamans once spoke to spirits that dwelt in every stone and stream, and where Scottish and Irish settlers brought their own ancient fears to mingle with the indigenous mysteries already rooted in these ancient peaks. Here, in America's most visited national park, beneath the veneer of hiking trails and visitor centers, lies a folklore so rich and unsettling that it transforms every shadow into a potential threat and every unexplained sound into evidence of something otherworldly. What you are about to discover are not mere ghost stories or simple superstitions. These are the foundational myths that explain why generations of mountain people approached these forests with a mixture of reverence and terror. These are the legends that served as both entertainment and survival guide, teaching children which places to avoid and adults which customs to respect if they hope to return home safely from their journeys into the deep woods. The Cherokee people, who called these mountains home for over 1,000 years before European contact, understood something that modern visitors often overlook. They knew that this landscape was alive, conscious, and populated by beings whose power could bring either great blessing or terrible destruction. Their stories were not fiction, but instruction manuals for navigating a world where the supernatural was as real and immediate as the morning mist that still rises from these valleys. When the first European settlers arrived in the late 1600s, they brought with them their own catalogue of supernatural beliefs, their own understanding of witches and demons and creatures that stalked the darkness. But instead of replacing the Cherokee traditions, these European fears merged with the indigenous wisdom, creating a unique and terrifying hybrid mythology that belongs entirely to these mountains. Today, as millions of visitors drive the winding roads of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, most are unaware that they are traveling through one of America's most haunted landscapes. They see the beauty, the wildlife, that they miss the deeper story's stunning vistas, but written in the very stones beneath their feet. They do not know that certain trails should not be walked alone, that certain sounds heard in the forest are warnings that should be heeded, and that some of the park's most popular destinations are built upon sites where terrible events unfolded centuries ago. This is the story of that hidden world, a journey into the folklore that continues to shape this landscape even today. We will explore the Cherokee legends that explain why certain peaks are considered sacred and why others are feared. We will uncover the tales of European settlers who encountered things in these forests that challenged their understanding of reality itself. And we will examine the modern encounters, the unexplained experiences that continue to occur within the park boundaries, suggesting that whatever forces inspired these ancient stories are still very much active. The Cherokee people who first inhabited these mountains possessed a sophisticated understanding of the supernatural world that surrounded them. Their cosmology was complex and detailed, recognizing multiple categories of spirits and otherworldly beings, each with their own domains, powers, and relationships to the human world. This was not a simple animistic belief system, but a carefully structured spiritual geography that mapped the invisible forces governing every aspect of life in the mountains. At the heart of Cherokee supernatural belief was the understanding that the physical world was merely the visible layer of a much more complex reality. Beneath the surface of everyday existence lay a vast network of spiritual forces, some beneficial, some neutral, and some actively hostile to human life. The Cherokee developed elaborate protocols for interacting with these forces, rituals and taboos that governed everything from hunting practices to the construction of dwellings. The mountains themselves were understood to be living entities, each peak and valley possessing its own personality and spiritual significance. Certain locations were recognized as thin places where the barrier between the physical and spiritual worlds was particularly permeable. These sites required special respect and careful approach, as they were often guarded by powerful supernatural beings who did not tolerate casual intrusion. Among the most feared of these guardian spirits was the creature known as Spearfinger, whose Cherokee name, Utlunta, literally translates as she had it sharp. This was not merely a monster from ancient mythology, but a very real threat that shaped Cherokee behavior for generations. Parents used the story of Spearfinger to teach children about the dangers that lurked beyond the safety of the village, but the legend served a deeper purpose as well, encoding important survival information about recognizing and avoiding genuine threats in the wilderness. The physical description of Spearfinger reveals the sophisticated way Cherokee folklore encoded practical warnings within supernatural narratives. Her stone-like skin, which made her nearly invulnerable to conventional weapons, represented the futility of fighting certain kinds of danger through direct confrontation. Her ability to shapeshift and appear as a harmless old woman taught the crucial lesson that threats in the wilderness often came disguised as something familiar and safe. But perhaps most importantly, Spearfinger's hunting method, her ability to wound victims so subtly that they did not realize they had been attacked until days later, served as a metaphor for the many hidden dangers that could kill a person slowly and invisibly. In a world where a small cut could lead to fatal infection, where consuming the wrong plant could cause death days later, and where exposure to certain elements could bring on illnesses that took time to manifest, the image of a creature who could inflict mortal wounds without immediate symptoms was both terrifying and instructionally valuable. The legend of Spearfinger also demonstrates the Cherokee understanding of how evil spreads through communities. Her preference for children as victims reflected the very real vulnerability of the young to both supernatural and natural dangers, while her method of using seasonal activities like chestnut gathering to locate her targets showed how even the most normal and necessary activities could become opportunities for disaster if proper precautions were not taken. The eventual defeat of Spearfinger represents one of the most sophisticated elements of Cherokee storytelling, encoding multiple layers of meaning within a single narrative. The fact that she could only be killed by striking her heart, which was hidden in her hand rather than her chest, taught the lesson that defeating certain kinds of evil requires unconventional thinking and careful observation rather than brute force. The role of the tiny chickadee in revealing her vulnerability emphasized the importance of paying attention to small signs and unexpected sources of wisdom. This pattern of hidden weakness in seemingly invulnerable supernatural enemies appears throughout Cherokee folklore and reflects a deep understanding of how seemingly impossible problems often have unexpected solutions. It taught generations of Cherokee people to look for alternative approaches when conventional methods failed and to value intelligence and observation over strength and aggression. The communal nature of Spearfinger's defeat also encoded important social lessons about the power of collective action and shared knowledge. No single warrior could defeat her, but when the entire community worked together, sharing information and coordinating their efforts, they could overcome even this most terrible of threats. This reflects the Cherokee understanding that survival in a dangerous world required not just individual courage and skill, but also strong social bonds and effective communication. The seasonal timing of Spearfinger's attacks, connected as they were to the autumn chestnut harvest, demonstrates how Cherokee folklore was intimately connected to the practical rhythms of mountain life. These stories were not abstract moral lessons, but practical guides tied to specific times and activities. They taught when to be especially vigilant, what signs to watch for, and how to modify behavior during periods of increased risk. The enduring power of the Spearfinger legend lies not just in its effectiveness as a cautionary tale, but in its sophisticated encoding of survival wisdom within a memorable narrative structure. Every element of the story, from her physical appearance to her hunting methods to the manner of her defeat, served multiple purposes, making it both an entertaining story and a comprehensive survival manual. This integration of practical instruction with supernatural narrative represents one of the most remarkable achievements of Cherokee folklore. These stories managed to preserve and transmit crucial knowledge across generations, while also providing the community with shared cultural touchstones that reinforced social bonds and collective identity. They were simultaneously entertainment, education, and spiritual practice, demonstrating the sophisticated understanding the Cherokee possessed of how stories function within human communities. The complexity of Cherokee supernatural beliefs extended far beyond individual monsters and spirits to encompass an entire cosmological system that governed the relationship between humans and the natural world. At the center of this system was the understanding that the mountains themselves were not merely geographical features, but living repositories of spiritual power, each with its own consciousness, memory, and purpose. The Cherokee recognized that certain locations within the mountains possessed what they called medicine, a concentrated spiritual energy that could be either beneficial or dangerous depending on how it was approached. These power spots were often marked by unusual natural formations, springs that never froze, trees that grew in impossible configurations, or clearings where the wildlife behaved differently. Such places required specific protocols for safe passage, rituals that had been refined over centuries of careful observation and sometimes tragic trial and error. Among the most mysterious of these sacred locations was the legend of Atagahi, the enchanted lake that existed somewhere deep within the mountain wilderness, but remained invisible to human eyes under normal circumstances. This was not simply another supernatural location, but a place that embodied the Cherokee understanding of the natural world as a realm of healing and restoration, protected by spiritual forces that humans could access only under very specific conditions. The story of Atagahi reveals the sophisticated Cherokee understanding of the relationship between spiritual purity and access to supernatural benefits. The young Cherokee man who first discovered the lake did so not through accident or luck, but through deliberate spiritual preparation, fasting and praying until his consciousness was purified enough to perceive what had always been there, but hidden from ordinary sight. This reflects a deep understanding that the supernatural world operates according to different rules than the physical world, rules that require inner transformation rather than external exploration. The description of Atagahi as a sanctuary for wounded and sick animals demonstrates the Cherokee belief that the natural world possessed its own systems of healing and restoration, independent of human intervention. The lake served as a kind of supernatural hospital where bears, birds, and other creatures could restore themselves through contact with sacred waters. This image encoded important ecological wisdom about the self-regulating nature of healthy ecosystems, while also teaching respect for the autonomous spiritual lives of non-human beings. The tragic outcome of the young man's return to Atagahi during the harsh winter reveals the Cherokee understanding of how desperation can lead to the violation of sacred boundaries. His decision to hunt in the sanctuary, motivated by his community's starvation, represents the kind of impossible choice that survival in the mountains sometimes demanded. The story does not condemn him as evil, but presents his action as a tragic necessity that nevertheless carried inevitable consequences. The supernatural response to his violation of the sanctuary's sanctity demonstrates the Cherokee belief that certain spiritual laws could not be broken without triggering automatic consequences. The bear's resurrection from the sacred waters and its pronouncement of betrayal shows how the spiritual world operated according to principles of justice that transcended human understanding or intention. The young man's good intentions could not protect him from the consequences of violating a fundamental spiritual boundary. The mysterious nature of his death, found with no tracks to indicate how the bears had reached him, reinforces the Cherokee understanding that spiritual consequences often manifested in ways that defied ordinary causation. This was not simply magical thinking, but a sophisticated recognition that the world contained forces and connections that operated beyond the reach of conventional observation and understanding. The permanent sealing of Atagahi from human access following this betrayal reflects the Cherokee belief that certain spiritual gifts, once violated, could not be restored. This was not punishment in the conventional sense, but rather the natural result of a fundamental change in the relationship between humans and the sacred world. The story teaches that some mistakes have permanent consequences, that certain forms of knowledge or access, once lost, cannot be recovered. The continuing visibility of morning mist from Klingman's Dome, said to rise from the hidden lake, demonstrates how Cherokee folklore maintained connection to sacred sites even after direct access was lost. This detail transforms the highest peak in the Smokies into a kind of window into the supernatural world, a place where visitors can still catch glimpses of the sacred realm that exists parallel to the ordinary landscape. This pattern of lost access to supernatural benefits appears throughout Cherokee folklore and reflects a deep understanding of how human actions can permanently alter spiritual relationships. These stories served as powerful warnings about the consequences of treating sacred spaces as mere resources to be exploited rather than relationships to be maintained through proper conduct and respect. The integration of seasonal and geographical details in these legends demonstrates how Cherokee supernatural beliefs were intimately connected to the practical realities of mountain life. These were not abstract spiritual concepts, but lived truths that governed daily behavior, seasonal activities, and long-term community planning. They provided a framework for understanding how human communities could maintain sustainable relationships with the powerful spiritual forces that govern the mountain ecosystem. The Cherokee understanding of the Smoky Mountains as a landscape populated by conscious spiritual beings extended to their beliefs about the Yunwi Tsunsdi, the little people who inhabited caves, dense forests, and other hidden places throughout the region. These beings were not merely folklore characters, but active participants in the spiritual ecology of the mountains, entities whose moods and actions could significantly impact human affairs. The little people represented a complex category of supernatural beings whose relationship with humans was fundamentally ambiguous. They were neither entirely benevolent nor purely malevolent, but rather possessed their own agenda and priorities that sometimes aligned with human interests and sometimes conflicted with them. This ambiguity made them particularly important figures in Cherokee folklore because they embodied the unpredictable nature of supernatural encounters in the wilderness. Stories of the little people often involved their nocturnal activities around human settlements, their mysterious ability to complete agricultural work overnight, and their tendency to both help and hinder human endeavors depending on how they were treated. These narratives served multiple functions, providing explanations for unexplained phenomena while also establishing protocols for maintaining positive relationships with these powerful but unpredictable neighbors. The Cherokee understanding that the little people required respectful acknowledgement but should not be directly observed reflects a sophisticated understanding of how to maintain beneficial relationships with supernatural forces. The stories taught that these beings valued privacy and autonomy, that they would withdraw their assistance if humans became too curious or intrusive about their activities. This principle of respectful non-interference appears throughout Cherokee supernatural beliefs and demonstrates their understanding that the spiritual world operated according to different social rules than human communities. The ability to benefit from supernatural assistance while maintaining appropriate boundaries required a delicate balance of gratitude, respect, and restraint that could only be learned through careful attention to traditional teachings. The geographical specificity of Little People traditions, their association with particular caves, rock formations, and forest groves, transformed the entire landscape of the Smokies into a complex social environment where humans shared space with numerous other conscious beings. This perspective fundamentally altered how Cherokee people moved through and interacted with the natural world, requiring constant awareness of whose territory one was entering and what protocols were appropriate for each location. The arrival of European settlers in the late 17th and early 18th centuries did not erase the supernatural landscape of the Smokies, but rather added new layers of fear and wonder to an already complex spiritual geography. These Scottish, Irish, and English immigrants brought with them their own ancient traditions of witchcraft, spectral encounters, and otherworldly beings, beliefs that had been shaped by centuries of life in the misty highlands and dark forests of their homelands. What emerged from this collision of supernatural traditions was something entirely new, a hybrid folklore that belonged neither to the old world nor to the indigenous traditions of the Cherokee, but to these specific mountains and the unique conditions of life within them. The settlers found that their familiar protective charms and warning signs often failed them in this new landscape, while the Cherokee discovered that their traditional protocols sometimes proved inadequate when dealing with the spiritual forces that accompanied these new inhabitants. The isolated nature of early settlement in the Smokies created conditions where folklore could evolve rapidly and take on intensely local characteristics. Families separated by just a few miles of rough mountain terrain might develop entirely different versions of the same basic supernatural beliefs, each adaptation reflecting the specific challenges and experiences of their particular hollow or ridge. This fragmentation and localization of folklore created a rich tapestry of overlapping and sometimes contradictory supernatural traditions that would persist for generations. Among the most persistent and terrifying of these hybrid traditions were the stories that emerged around the abandoned settlements that dotted the mountain landscape. The harsh realities of frontier life meant that entire communities could disappear within a single generation, leaving behind only crumbling foundations, overgrown fields, and the lingering sense that something had gone terribly wrong in these places. The phenomenon that would later become known as the cussing cover emerged from this intersection of European superstition and Appalachian isolation, a story that encoded deep anxieties about death, remarriage, and the violation of sacred promises. The tale of Mavis Estep and her husband Basil represents more than a simple ghost story, but rather a complex meditation on the nature of marital bonds, the power of deathbed vows, and the dangerous consequences of treating sacred objects as mere possessions. Mavis Estep's lifelong terror of lightning, rooted in her birth during a violent thunderstorm, reflects the mountain understanding that certain people were marked by fate from the moment of their arrival in the world. Her superstitious refusal to allow metal beds in her home was not mere eccentricity, but a form of protective magic, an attempt to control her destiny through careful management of her environment. The handmade quilts that she created represented not just domestic skill, but a kind of spiritual armor, objects imbued with her care and intention. The tragedy that unfolded after her death reveals the complex social dynamics of mountain communities, where survival adaptation to changing circumstances. Basil's remar, often required rapierage to a much younger woman, represented a practical necessity in a world where running a household required the labor of two adults, but it also represented a potential violation of the spiritual bonds that death was supposed to make permanent. The supernatural response to this violation demonstrates the mountain understanding that certain objects could become repositories of spiritual power, especially when they were created with love and protected by solemn vows. The quilt that Mavis had forbidden to be used on a metal bed became a kind of supernatural weapon, a conduit for otherworldly justice that could reach across the boundary between life and death to enforce the promises made by the living. The precision of the supernatural punishment, killing only Basil while leaving both his new wife and the cabin unharmed, reveals the sophisticated moral calculus that governed mountain supernatural beliefs. This was not random destruction, but targeted justice, punishment that fell only upon the one who had violated his sacred promise. The preservation of the quilt itself, untouched by the lightning that destroyed everything around it, demonstrated that the supernatural forces at work were not chaotic, but purposeful. The eventual sale of the cussing cover to a collector transforms this local tragedy into a cautionary tale about the commodification of sacred objects. The quilt's removal from the community that understood its history and significance represents a kind of spiritual exile, a severing of the object from the context that gave it meaning. This detail reflects mountain anxieties about the intrusion of outside economic forces that could strip away the spiritual significance of traditional objects by treating them as mere curiosities. The story's persistence in local folklore demonstrates how supernatural narratives serve to reinforce community values and social expectations. The tale of the cussing cover functioned as a warning about the consequences of breaking sacred promises, but it also provided a framework for understanding how the dead continued to participate in the moral life of the living. It taught that certain bonds could not be dissolved by death, and that the violation of these bonds carried consequences that extended far beyond the immediate participants. The geographical specificity of the story, rooted in the particular landscape and social conditions of Cades Cove, demonstrates how mountain folklore was intimately connected to place. These were not universal moral lessons, but location-specific warnings that reflected the unique challenges and tensions of life in this particular valley. The story could not be transplanted to another setting without losing much of its power, because it was fundamentally about the spiritual ecology of this specific place. The continuing association of supernatural activity with the former Estep home site reveals how mountain folklore created lasting geographical markers that influenced behavior for generations. Even decades after the original events, locals would approach certain areas with caution, understanding that some places retained the imprint of powerful emotions and traumatic events. This created a kind of spiritual cartography that overlay the physical landscape with zones of varying supernatural significance. The evolution of the Greenbrier restaurant ghost story demonstrates how mountain folklore adapted to changing social and economic conditions while maintaining its essential character and function. The transformation of the original Greenbrier Lodge from an exclusive resort for wealthy vacationers into a local restaurant reflects the broader economic changes that swept through Appalachia in the 20th century. But the supernatural traditions associated with the location persisted and evolved. The story of Lydia, the bride left at the altar, who took her own life in her wedding dress, taps into universal fears about romantic betrayal and social humiliation, while also encoding specifically Appalachian anxieties about the intersection of traditional mountain culture with outside influences. The wealthy visitors who frequented the original lodge represented a different world with different values, and Lydia's tragic fate can be read as a cautionary tale about the dangers of trying to bridge these cultural divides. The supernatural revenge that followed Lydia's suicide, her transformation into a large cat that tracked down and killed her faithless fiancé, reflects the mountain understanding that certain wrongs demanded otherworldly justice. The fact that cougars had been extinct in the Smokies for generations made this supernatural explanation not just plausible, but necessary, the only way to account for a death that defied natural explanation. The modern paranormal investigations conducted at the Greenbrier restaurant represent a fascinating evolution of traditional supernatural beliefs, the application of contemporary technology and methodology to ancient spiritual phenomena. The electronic voice phenomenon captured during these investigations, where a female voice responded to a direct question with the cheeky reply that she was not dead, suggests that whatever forces inspired the original folklore continue to manifest in ways that can be documented and studied. This persistence of supernatural activity across multiple generations and through dramatic changes in the social and economic life of the region, demonstrates the enduring power of place-based spiritual phenomena. The Greenbrier location appears to retain its supernatural significance regardless of the specific human activities conducted there, suggesting that certain sites possess an inherent spiritual charge that transcends the particular events that originally established their reputation. The integration of modern paranormal investigation techniques with traditional folklore represents a uniquely contemporary approach to understanding supernatural phenomena. Rather than dismissing the old stories as primitive superstition, these investigations treat them as potentially accurate reports of genuine supernatural activity, worthy of serious study using the best available tools and methods. The continuing encounters with Lydia's spirit, reported by multiple witnesses over several decades, demonstrate how supernatural traditions maintain their relevance and power across changing generations. The fact that these encounters continue to occur in ways that are consistent with the original folklore suggests that the spiritual forces that shaped mountain supernatural beliefs remain active and accessible to those who approach them with appropriate respect and attention. The story of Lucy on Roaring Fork Motor Nature Trail represents one of the most frequently reported contemporary supernatural encounters in the park, demonstrating how traditional folklore continues to evolve and adapt to modern conditions. The transformation of this former settlement area into a popular tourist destination has not eliminated its supernatural associations, but rather created new contexts for otherworldly encounters. The reports of a young woman in period dress appearing along the motor trail, often in the early morning hours when visibility is limited by mountain mist, reflect the continuing power of place-based spiritual phenomena. Lucy's appearances seem to follow patterns established by traditional mountain folklore, manifesting at times and in conditions that echo the original circumstances of her life and death. The integration of these contemporary encounters with the park's official interpretive programs creates an interesting tension between scientific education and supernatural tradition. While the National Park Service maintains a strictly factual approach to historical interpretation, the persistence of supernatural experiences among visitors and staff suggests that the spiritual landscape of the Smokies operates according to principles that transcend conventional scientific understanding. The fact that Lucy's appearances are most commonly reported by visitors who have no prior knowledge of her story suggests that these encounters represent genuine spiritual phenomena rather than psychological projection or cultural conditioning. The consistency of witness descriptions across multiple decades and diverse visitor populations provides compelling evidence that something more than folklore is at work in these locations. The continuing vitality of supernatural traditions within the boundaries of America's most visited national park demonstrates the remarkable persistence of place-based spiritual phenomena. Despite the overlay of modern infrastructure, scientific interpretation, and mass tourism, the essential spiritual character of the Smoky Mountains continues to assert itself through encounters that defy conventional explanation and demand recognition of forces that operate beyond the reach of ordinary understanding. The contemporary encounters with Lucy and other supernatural phenomena throughout the Great Smoky Mountains National Park reveal a fascinating paradox at the heart of modern Appalachian spirituality. While millions of visitors arrive each year equipped with GPS devices, digital cameras, and scientific explanations for natural phenomena, they consistently report experiences that defy technological documentation and rational analysis. These encounters suggest that the spiritual landscape of the Smokies operates according to principles that remain fundamentally unchanged despite centuries of cultural transformation. The persistence of these supernatural manifestations within the boundaries of a federally managed park creates unique challenges for both visitors and park personnel. Official policy requires that all interpretive programs focus on documented historical facts and scientifically verifiable natural phenomena, yet the spiritual experiences that continue to occur throughout the park represent an equally important aspect of the region's cultural heritage. This tension between official recognition and lived experience reflects broader conflicts between scientific materialism and traditional spiritual understanding that have shaped Appalachian culture for generations. The geographical distribution of supernatural encounters within the park reveals patterns that correlate strongly with sites of historical significance and natural power. Areas that were sacred to the Cherokee, locations of former settlements, and places where traumatic events occurred continue to generate the highest concentrations of unexplained phenomena. This suggests that the spiritual significance of specific locations persists across cultural boundaries and historical transitions, creating a kind of supernatural continuity that transcends the particular beliefs of any single group. The evolution of folklore collection and preservation efforts within the park demonstrates changing attitudes toward traditional supernatural beliefs. Early ethnographic work conducted in the region often dismissed local supernatural traditions as primitive superstition that would naturally disappear as education and modernization progressed. However, contemporary folklorists and cultural historians have come to recognize these traditions as sophisticated systems of environmental knowledge and social regulation that deserve serious study and respectful preservation. The integration of Cherokee supernatural traditions with European folklore created unique hybrid beliefs that could only have emerged in this specific geographical and cultural context. The mountain environment itself seemed to encourage this blending, providing conditions where different supernatural traditions could interact and influence each other in ways that would have been impossible in more culturally homogeneous settings. The result was a folklore system that was neither purely indigenous nor purely European, but distinctively Appalachian. Among the most mysterious of these hybrid traditions are the stories surrounding the ancient stone structures found throughout the park, particularly the enigmatic wall at Fort Mountain, just outside the current park boundaries. These constructions, which predate known Cherokee occupation of the region, have become associated with the legendary Moon-Eyed people, beings described as pale, nocturnal humanoids who allegedly inhabited the mountains before the arrival of the Cherokee. The Moon-Eyed people represent one of the most controversial elements of Smoky Mountain folklore, existing at the intersection of archaeological mystery and supernatural legend. The physical evidence for their existence, including the massive stone wall at Fort Mountain and various petroglyphs found throughout the region, suggests that some historical basis may underlie the folklore. However, the supernatural characteristics attributed to these beings, particularly their extreme sensitivity to sunlight and their nocturnal lifestyle, place them firmly within the realm of otherworldly phenomena. The Cherokee accounts of their encounters with the Moon-Eyed people describe a race of beings who possessed advanced building skills and sophisticated knowledge of astronomy and engineering, yet were fundamentally alien in their physical characteristics and social organization. These descriptions suggest contact between the Cherokee and a population that differed dramatically from any known Native American group, leading to speculation about possible connections to pre-Columbian European visitors or unknown indigenous peoples who adapted to extreme environmental conditions. The nocturnal nature of the Moon-Eyed people created unique challenges for interaction with normal human populations. Their inability to tolerate daylight meant that all contact occurred under conditions of limited visibility and heightened supernatural atmosphere. This temporal separation between the two populations may have contributed to the mystical character of the folklore, as encounters that occurred exclusively in darkness would naturally acquire otherworldly associations. The reported activities of the Moon-Eyed people, particularly their tendency to complete agricultural work under cover of darkness, parallels similar traditions found throughout world folklore regarding helpful supernatural beings. However, the specific details of these accounts, including their methods and timing, reflect adaptations to the particular environmental and social conditions of the Appalachian region. These beings were not generic folkloric helpers, but entities specifically suited to the rhythms and challenges of mountain life. The eventual disappearance or expulsion of the Moon-Eyed people from the region represents a common theme in supernatural folklore worldwide, the retreat of otherworldly beings in the face of expanding human settlement. However, the Cherokee accounts suggest that this withdrawal was not voluntary, but resulted from deliberate action to drive these beings from territories that the Cherokee claimed for their own use. This aggressive displacement of supernatural inhabitants reflects a more complex relationship between human and otherworldly populations than simple coexistence or mutual avoidance. The continuing reports of nocturnal encounters with pale, diminutive humanoids throughout the park suggest that the Moon-Eyed people may not have disappeared entirely, but rather retreated to more remote areas where they continue to maintain a secretive existence. These modern encounters typically occur in the deepest wilderness areas of the park, far from established trails and tourist facilities, and involve brief sightings of beings that flee immediately upon being observed. The consistency of these contemporary reports with traditional Cherokee descriptions provides compelling evidence for the continuing presence of some population that corresponds to the folklore of the Moon-Eyed people. However, the extreme elusiveness of these beings and their apparent determination to avoid human contact makes systematic study or documentation virtually impossible. They remain one of the most tantalizing mysteries of Smoky Mountain supernatural tradition. The impact of dam construction and landscape modification throughout the region has created new categories of supernatural phenomena, while potentially disrupting traditional spiritual sites. The creation of artificial lakes and the flooding of ancient valleys have submerged numerous Cherokee sacred sites and early settlement areas, creating underwater landscapes that exist in a state of perpetual twilight. These submerged locations have become associated with unique forms of supernatural activity, including reports of voices heard beneath the water and apparitions that appear to walk along the lake bottom. The environmental changes brought about by modern development have also affected the traditional patterns of supernatural encounter throughout the region. Species reintroduction programs have brought back animals that had been absent from the ecosystem for generations, while climate change has altered the seasonal rhythms that govern traditional supernatural activities. These changes have created new contexts for otherworldly encounters, while potentially disrupting the ancient patterns that shape traditional folklore. The establishment of the national park itself represents a fundamental transformation in the relationship between human communities and the supernatural landscape of the Smokies. The removal of permanent human settlements from large areas of the park has created conditions more similar to the pre-settlement wilderness than had existed for over a century. This rewilding of the landscape has coincided with reports of increased supernatural activity in areas that had been dormant during the period of intensive human occupation. The restoration of forest ecosystems and the recovery of wildlife populations have been accompanied by the apparent reactivation of spiritual sites that had been suppressed or disrupted by agricultural and logging activities. Areas that showed little supernatural activity during the period of intensive human use have begun generating encounters that suggest the return of otherworldly inhabitants who had withdrawn during the era of environmental destruction. The creation of hiking trails and recreational facilities throughout the park has made previously inaccessible areas available to large numbers of visitors, many of whom arrive with no knowledge of the supernatural traditions associated with specific locations. This has led to numerous encounters between unprepared visitors and spiritual phenomena that local mountain people had traditionally approached with careful preparation and appropriate protective measures. The democratization of access to formerly restricted spiritual sites has created new challenges for both human visitors and supernatural inhabitants. Traditional protocols for approaching sacred locations were developed over centuries of careful observation and sometimes tragic experience, but these safeguards are unknown to most contemporary park visitors. The result has been an increase in supernatural encounters that occur without the cultural framework necessary to interpret and respond to them appropriately. The modern infrastructure of the park, including roads, bridges, and buildings, has created new interfaces between the physical and spiritual worlds. These artificial structures often become focal points for supernatural activity, as otherworldly beings adapt their traditional patterns of behavior to accommodate the changed landscape. Bridges in particular seem to attract supernatural attention, perhaps because they represent thresholds between different geographical and spiritual territories. The electromagnetic environment created by modern technology has also influenced supernatural manifestations throughout the park. Cell phone towers, radio equipment, and electronic devices carried by visitors create energy fields that may interact with spiritual phenomena in ways that are not yet understood. Some researchers have suggested that these electromagnetic influences may actually enhance certain types of supernatural activity while suppressing others, creating new patterns of otherworldly encounter that reflect the technological character of contemporary life. The seasonal rhythms of park visitation have created new temporal patterns for supernatural encounters. The concentration of human activity during peak tourist seasons appears to influence the timing and intensity of otherworldly manifestations, with some phenomena becoming more active during periods of high visitation, while others retreat until the quieter winter months. This suggests that supernatural inhabitants of the park are responsive to human presence and adjust their activities according to the level and type of human intrusion into their territories. The diverse cultural backgrounds of contemporary park visitors have introduced new interpretive frameworks for understanding supernatural encounters. Visitors from different ethnic and religious traditions bring their own supernatural beliefs and expectations to their park experiences, creating a complex overlay of cultural interpretation that affects how otherworldly phenomena are perceived and reported. This cultural diversity has enriched the contemporary folklore of the park, while also creating new challenges for understanding the essential character of place-based spiritual phenomena. The documentation and sharing of supernatural experiences through social media and online forums has created new mechanisms for the preservation and transmission of supernatural folklore. Contemporary encounters are recorded and shared instantly across vast networks of interested individuals, creating a kind of collective supernatural memory that transcends the traditional geographical boundaries of folklore transmission. This technological amplification of supernatural narrative has both preserved important experiences that might otherwise have been forgotten and introduced new forms of distortion and embellishment that complicate efforts to understand genuine spiritual phenomena. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park thus represents a unique laboratory for studying the interaction between traditional supernatural beliefs and contemporary technological culture. The persistence of otherworldly phenomena within this highly managed and scientifically monitored environment suggests that spiritual forces operate according to principles that transcend human understanding and control. The continuing evolution of supernatural folklore within the park boundaries demonstrates that these ancient traditions retain their vitality and relevance even within the context of modern recreational and educational institutions. The challenge facing contemporary visitors to the Smokies is learning to navigate this complex supernatural landscape with appropriate respect and understanding. The spiritual traditions that govern Cherokee and early settler interaction with otherworldly phenomena were developed through centuries of careful observation and sometimes costly experience. These traditional safeguards and protocols represent accumulated wisdom about how human beings can safely and respectfully interact with spiritual forces that remain active throughout the region. The future of supernatural tradition in the Great Smoky Mountains depends largely on the ability of contemporary culture to integrate traditional spiritual wisdom with modern scientific understanding. Rather than dismissing supernatural beliefs as primitive superstition, there is growing recognition that these traditions may encode important information about environmental relationships and spiritual realities that deserve serious study and respectful preservation. The continuing vitality of supernatural phenomena throughout the park suggests that the spiritual landscape of the Smokies will continue to challenge and instruct visitors who approach it with appropriate humility and openness. The convergence of all these supernatural traditions within the boundaries of America's most visited national park creates a unique phenomenon in contemporary American folklore. The Great Smoky Mountains have become a kind of living laboratory where ancient spiritual forces continue to operate alongside modern recreational infrastructure, creating encounters that challenge visitors to expand their understanding of what constitutes reality within these ancient peaks. What makes the Smokies particularly fascinating from a folkloric perspective is how the landscape itself seems to actively participate in the preservation and evolution of supernatural traditions. Unlike many regions where modernization has effectively severed connections to traditional spiritual beliefs, these mountains appear to maintain their otherworldly character regardless of human attempts to impose rational, scientific frameworks upon them. The mist that rises from hidden valleys, the shadows that move independently of their sources, and the sounds that echo from empty hollows all contribute to an atmosphere where supernatural encounters feel not just possible, but inevitable. The psychological impact of extended exposure to this supernatural landscape cannot be underestimated. Visitors who arrive as skeptics often find their certainties gradually eroded by accumulated small experiences that resist conventional explanation. A glimpse of movement in peripheral vision, a voice heard when no one else is present, a sudden temperature drop in bright sunlight. These seemingly minor anomalies accumulate into a growing awareness that the mountains operate according to principles that transcend ordinary understanding. The park's official interpretive programs, while necessarily focused on documented historical facts and scientific phenomena, cannot entirely ignore the supernatural traditions that form such a central part of the region's cultural heritage. Rangers and interpretive staff often find themselves in the delicate position of acknowledging these traditions without endorsing them, creating a kind of institutional folklore that recognizes supernatural beliefs as culturally significant while maintaining scientific objectivity about their literal truth claims. This official ambivalence towards supernatural traditions reflects broader cultural tensions about how modern institutions should relate to traditional spiritual beliefs. The National Park Service's mission includes both the preservation of natural resources and the interpretation of cultural heritage, but supernatural folklore occupies an ambiguous position that fits neither category completely. These traditions are undeniably part of the cultural heritage of the region, yet their claims about the nature of reality often conflict with scientific methodologies that guide park management decisions. The folklore of the Great Smoky Mountains stands as testament to something profound and enduring about the relationship between place and story, between landscape and the human need to understand forces that operate beyond the boundaries of rational explanation. These tales, whether they speak of ancient Cherokee spirits or the ghosts of European settlers, share a common recognition that these mountains harbor mysteries that cannot be reduced to simple scientific observation or dismissed as primitive superstition. They remind us that even in our age of satellite navigation and digital documentation, there remain places where the old rules still apply, where respect and humility are better guides than technology and skepticism. Perhaps the true power of these stories lies not in their truth, but in their ability to transform how we experience these ancient peaks, turning every visit into a potential encounter with the sacred and unknown.